Hello, welcome to my coronavirus classroom. I'm Janessa Jacobs, and these are connective tissues. So, I'm gonna be honest with you. I've got a little 4-year-old assistant running around here who is supposed to be taking a nap. He never did get that nap. I ended in this state of preparation when I finally gave up on that. And so, this is how you get me. And he is going to be very quiet while I teach class, right? But he can help us with maybe our muscle of the day and our bone of the day. Definitely maybe the muscle meditation. All right, okay, so I don't know, coronavirus class, it never quite works out as I expect, and I didn't have the proper bone and muscle of the day in this lecture. That's okay because we can go with it. So we're gonna go with 2 bones of the day, the clavicle and the scapula. These bones make up what's called your pectoral girdle. And your pectoral girdle is what is going to hold your humerus to your thorax. So last week we learned all about the bones of the arm and forearm. We learned about the humerus and the radius and ulna. So now how do we get this upper limb onto your trunk? And we do it with a pectoral girdle, and that has 2 bones, a clavicle and a scapula. So on the practical, you won't have to be able to identify clavicle left versus right, but you might have to identify this bone. And it's okay. I know that it's going to be weird because it's a picture of this bone like on a table in my living room, but that's okay. There's no other bone that looks like this. I mean, the opposite side has the opposite clavicle, but hopefully you know what I mean. Okay, scapula, also no bone that looks like this. You do have to be able to tell whether your scapula is left or right. And that's pretty easy to do when we start learning these bone markings. So the area of the scapula that articulates with the head of the humerus is called the glenoid cavity. Hey, little man, can you give me that arm, please? Thank you. So this is the glenoid cavity, and that has to be facing laterally so that it can articulate with the head of the humerus. Thank you so much. And so, it's gonna work out perfectly. So, this is a left arm and a left scapula. So how I know it's a left scapula is because this thing right here is the spine. You can actually palpate the spine of your scapula back here. And so you find the spine of the scapula, and that has to be posterior. Because if you look at this bone, you wouldn't want, you can't put, that, it doesn't work. So this thing here, this nice dip here, dips in bones are called fossa. This nice fossa here is a good marker. This is called the subscapular fossa, and that is what's going to sit here on your thorax. So if I use those 2 markers, the spine going posterior and the glenoid cavity going laterally, I can tell that this is a left scapula. And you don't have to be able to identify left clavicle versus right clavicle, but these 2 do articulate. And so if we look at this, what happens is if we're looking at the markings that you need to know on the scapula, that was 2 of them. This process here that's anterior is the coracoid process. This process right here is the acromion. That's what makes this region your acromial region. So this is the acromion, and that's the part that's going to articulate with your clavicle. So those 2 bones come together like this and hook your pectoral girdle onto your thoracic cage, and then your humerus, I mean, look how unstable this is. It's not very stable at all, but it's really good for giving you a great range of motion. And then your humerus plugs in right here. So you can see you get a huge range of motion. What's going to hold all of these together then is a bunch of muscles we'll talk about. I should have done the rotator cuff muscles. No, you already have 2 bones of the day, so there are a bunch of rotator cuff muscles. So maybe we'll talk about those tomorrow. There's an idea. So anyway, the thing about the pectoral girdle is that it gives up stability to get a bunch of flexibility, and it's the opposite in your pelvic girdle. We'll talk about that soon. Okay, so bones of the day, clavicle, scapula, markings that you need to know on the scapula, glenoid cavity, coracoid process, acromion, spine. Now all these fossa you need to know as well. And muscles are going to sit in there. And what's nice is that when you start memorizing all these muscles, you'll see that the muscle called the supraspinatus sits in the supraspinous fossa. And the supraspinous fossa is above supra, the spine of the scapula. The infraspinous fossa is below it, infra, below the spine of the scapula. And the subscapular fossa, sub is another way to say below, subscapular fossa is right here and it's under the whole scapula. So those are the markings that you need to know for the scapula. You don't need to know any markings for the clavicle. Those are your bones of the day. That's the pectoral girdle. Whoa! We're almost out of the upper limb. Maybe tomorrow we'll do the hand and the muscles of the pectoral girdle. We'll think on that. Okay, muscle of the day. Okay, so we can see on our little skeleton here, which is also fair game for the practical, how all these bones articulate together. So here's our clavicle, which is articulating with the acromion of the scapula, and then the humerus articulates with the glenoid cavity. Infraspinous fossa, supraspinous fossa, spine, acromion, coracoid process, glenoid fossa, or glenoid cavity, either works, and then underneath there is the subscapular fossa. All right. Now, muscle of the day. This might be one of my favorite muscles. It's called the deltoid. I just love deltoids, and people who have well-developed deltoids, I mean, I don't necessarily love them, but I love their deltoids. So, deltoids. The deltoid gets its name. We'll see that there are a bunch of rules that we use for naming our muscles, and one of them can be shape. And the deltoid looks like the Greek letter delta, kind of. And it's got three kind of big bodies that are going to help do the three different actions that you are required to know for your deltoid: abduction, flexion, and extension of the arm. So if you recall from last class, I said that this is your arm and this is your forearm. So the deltoid moves your arm. And since it has these three different bodies, it can do these three different motions. So flexion is decreasing the angle. So the anterior belly here can flex your arm. Extension is increasing the angle. This is hyperextension. If I increase beyond 180 degrees or beyond anatomical position, I'm hyperextending. So these posterior muscle fibers can help with that. So as I am coming back down and extending, the posterior fibers are grabbing. And then as far as abduction, what's abduction? Abduction is when you move away from the midline in the frontal plane. So it's kind of a bad analogy, but it helps you remember. It's not a bad analogy, it's a great analogy. It's just, you know, a little dark. We'll pretend I got it from the lab assistant. So abduction, if a child is abducted from their mom, God, hope that never happens, they are taken away. If you abduct your limb, you're taking it away. So your deltoid abducts your arm, and it flexes your arm, and it extends your arm. So let's do our muscle meditation. We're going to close our eyes and breathe in, deltoid, and breathe out, flexes arm, and breathe in, deltoid, and breathe out, abducts arm, and breathe in, deltoid, and breathe out, extends arm, and breathe in, deltoid, and breathe out, flexes arm, and breathe in, deltoid, and breathe out, abducts arm, and breathe in, deltoid, and breathe out, extends arm, and breathe in, deltoid, and breathe out, flexes arm, and breathe in, deltoid, and breathe out, abducts arm, and breathe in, deltoid, and breathe out, extends arm, and breathe in, deltoid, and breathe out, flexes, extends, and abducts arm. Breathe in, and breathe out, and come back to class. All right, I have some quick questions for you to get you thinking about just tissues to review what you know from what we learned about last time. So, cell junctions would be found in the blank of the plasma membrane and epithelial tissues. A, apical surface. B, lateral surface. C, basal surface. D, all of the above. The answer is B, lateral surface. So if you think about it, epithelial tissues are those cells, or are those tissues that have epithelial cells. And if we are going to join them up so that they can form a cohesive fabric, then we find those junctions in the lateral surfaces of those cells. You can't join cells on the apical surface. The apical surface is free, and you're not going to join cells to each other on the basal surface. The basal surface is attached to the basement membrane. So, all right, which portion of an epithelial cell in the stomach would be in contact with food? A, the apical surface, B, the lateral surface, C, the basal surface, D, all of the above. This time it's the apical surface, so that's the side that's free. All right, so connective tissues. Connective tissues are the tissues that are hopefully, very obviously, going to connect one tissue type to another. And the big functions of connective tissues are binding, supporting, protecting, insulating, storing reserve fuel, and transporting substances. I'm not going to make you write all of this down right now because we're going to talk about our specific connective tissues and what each of them are doing. So, for example, blood is transporting substances. Adipose tissue is insulating and storing reserve energy. It also gives some protection. But bone is a connective tissue. It's doing a lot of protection, offering a lot of support. Binding are areolar connective tissue. So all of these functions of connective tissues will be addressed when we talk about each specific connective tissue. So that's where we're going. We'll get there. We have 4 major classes of connective tissue. Connective tissue propers, which are really properly attaching one connective tissue to the other. And then these 3 specialized types of connective tissues. Cartilage, we'll look at a little bit. We're going to actually look at all of the tissues in class, but we're not going to spend a great deal of time talking about some of these other ones until we move to the chapter that talks about them. So bone tissue, osseous tissue, has its whole own chapter and its whole own lab. That's when we will actually look at cartilage. So that's when we'll talk a little bit more about cartilage when we get there. So we'll have a brief introduction today to those things, but then we'll talk more about it. Blood has its whole own chapter next semester. So really what we're going to talk a lot about today is connective tissue proper. First, let's talk about the characteristics of connective tissues. How is it that blood, which is a liquid tissue, can be related to bone, which is a solid tissue? And that is because of the first characteristic of connective tissues, which is that they arise from the same embryonic origin. So 1, they arise from the same embryonic origin. What does this mean? They're starting as the same type of stem cell, these cells called mesenchymal cells in utero. So that's the thing that relates them all, is that they all arise from these mesenchymal stem cells. So we'll put that kind of in parentheses. These are mesenchymal stem cells. And as you'll see, some of these tissues have, like blood, for example, has a lot of different cell types in it. So these mesenchymal stem cells will differentiate and become what's called a hematopoietic stem cell. So it's the stem cell of the bloodline. Or in our bone, we have a bunch of different cell types. So we'll have an osteoprogenitor cell, osteogenic stem cells. So our mesenchymal cells are going to be able to divide to give rise to other stem cells, and then all of the tissues that are going, or all of the cells that are going to be found in our connective tissues. The second characteristic of our connective tissues is that they have varying levels of vascularity.
This is the thing that carries the blood.
Is it?
Yeah, Rachel. It's the thing that carries the blood all around us.
It actually looks pretty close to that. So they have varying levels of vascularity of things that carry the blood. that come to them. So bone is highly vascularized, which surprises a lot of people. But yeah, bone is a living, it seems all dry and solid, but it's really dry. I mean, it is very solid, but it's full of blood vessels that are going through that solid tissue and providing it the nutrients that it needs. What else? Blood. Doesn't have blood vessels that serve the blood. Cartilage is almost avascular. It does not have a high blood supply. So that's our second characteristic, is that our connective tissues display varying levels of vascularity.
Do you know what these things that go up are about?
I don't know what they're all about.
They do not carry blood. They make us laugh from here to there to here.
They make us laugh from here to there to here? Those are the best things ever in the body. I love you. You're great. Okay. The third characteristic of our connective tissues is that they all have resident cells that secrete extracellular matrix.
Can you please carry me?
I can't, honey. I'm teaching a class. I gotta write higher. So, okay, they have resident cells that secrete extracellular matrix. What is that? Resident cells, and these secrete extracellular matrix, which I abbreviate as ECM. The cells that we find in connective tissues are going to vary from tissue type to tissue type, but primarily we find what are called fibroblasts. And fibroblasts, blast cells are immature cells that secrete extracellular matrix. They actively secrete extracellular matrix in growing tissues. Cytes are the mature cells that are maintaining extracellular matrix or doing whatever it is they do. So we'll see that, we'll talk about that later. So cytes are mature cells, and these are more about maintaining as opposed to like actively secreting for growth. These will maintain our extracellular matrix. So what is this extracellular matrix stuff that you talk about, lady? It is, Theseus,
What?
I love you. Here's the eraser. I need it. Extracellular matrix is the stuff that all of our cells are going to be secreting. So, okay, you just said that. Yeah, well, it's made of two components, ground substance and protein fibers. So ground substance is non-living substance secreted by the cells, and they surround themselves in it. And what it is going to do is then contain all of the protein fibers and the cells. So this is non-living material. Oh, this guy's gonna kill my markers.
What?
Nothing, I love you.
Well, who's going to steal your marker?
If you keep leaving the lids off, it's you. Ground substance is the non-living material that holds everything. So this is going to vary in viscosity or thickness. We'll say it varies in viscosity from liquid or from fluid in plasma, blood plasma, to solid in bone. So like cartilage has thick, viscous, gel-like ground substance, so it's semi-solid. Bone is actually solid, and blood plasma is liquid. So ground substance is going to change a lot. And then we've got protein fibers that are going to be varying throughout all of our tissue types. We'll talk about it in a second. And so the composition and arrangement of all of these things is what's going to vary from one tissue to the next. So I just told you about ground substance. It varies in viscosity from liquid in blood to solid in bone. And then contained in that, throughout that ground substance, we find protein fibers. And there are three types of protein fibers that we'll find in varying concentrations in each tissue. So let's talk about those. So collagen fibers are the most abundant, and they're also the strongest, and they have really great tensile strength. So they have the ability to resist a lot of tension. So they're the most abundant, they're the strongest. Collagen is a very strong protein. And what it does is collagen fibers give tensile strength. So they can resist a lot of tension. The second type of protein fiber we can find is an elastic fiber. And our elastic fibers contain this protein called elastin. And what elastin does for a tissue is give it elasticity. It gives elasticity, and what that is the ability to stretch and recoil. Don't mess with that microphone. So, in places like the great vessels of the heart, where you need to be able to resist a lot of pressure, let's say when your ventricles are contracting and forcing all of that blood out, they need to be able to stretch your great vessels. And then when your ventricles relax, they need to be able to push back on that blood so that you don't lose blood pressure and pass out. So that happens because of the elastic fibers, or the elastic connective tissue that we find there. So elastic fibers give elasticity, stretch and recoil. So that's what we can say about that. Elasticity is the ability to stretch and recoil. So good on that. The last type of fiber that we can find in connective tissues is called a reticular fiber. These are the most rare. We find them in reticular connective tissues. I mean, some tissues have all three fiber types, like areolar connective tissue has all three fiber types. But we find a high proportion of these in a connective tissue called reticular connective tissue, and that is in our lymphatic organs. And these organs are the organs that are going to house our white blood cells. So reticular connective tissue forms this stuff called the stroma in those organs, and that's like this fibrous skeleton of those organs that allows for whole cells to pass in and out of them. It's too hot. I gotta put on a different shirt if this is how lecture's gonna go. I'll be back. So other types of cells that we can find. So actually, in the interest of giving you something that's pretty easy to read, these blast cells are the immature form of cell that's actively secreting our ground substance and extracellular matrix fibers. Fibroblasts are the primary type that we find in connective tissue proper. That's what we're going to be spending our most amount of time talking about today, is connective tissue proper. Chondroblasts are the cells that we see in cartilage. These are going to become chondrocytes, the mature cells of cartilage. Osteoblasts are found in bone. We have a lot of different bone cell types, so we'll worry about that when we get there. Hematopoietic stem cells are those stem cells I mentioned that... What is even going on? I don't even know where my microphone is. How much lecture can I get done before he gets back from the bathroom? All right, kinetic sand is on the table. Hopefully I can just finish this lecture. All right, so the immature cells are the blast cells that are actively secreting stuff. The less active form of the blast cells are the cytes that are going to be maintaining the health of the tissue. So they will become kind of like surrounded in this extracellular matrix they're going to secrete. We'll talk about that in a little bit. As far as other types of cells that we can find in connective tissues, we can find fat cells. These are called adipocytes. And we find them in high concentration in adipose tissue. So adipocytes are fat cells. These store nutrients. It also helps. We find them packed around some organs and things for helping with protection. Helps with insulating as well. But so they're packing up a bunch of fat so that our adipose tissue, where we find them in high concentration, can do all of those things. White blood cells we find in blood. So these are going to be involved in immunity. We'll talk a lot about them next semester. Mast cells are these cells that are involved in initiating inflammatory responses in tissues. So the key about this is that it's a local, these cells are localized to tissues. There are other white blood cells that are inflammatory, but they can migrate, or they're released from the bone marrow into the blood and can migrate through tissues. These are stuck, they're fixed. Macrophages are phagocytic cells. Macro means large, phage eaters. These are phagocytic cells that are going to eat debris, dead cells, microorganisms, anything foreign to the body. Okay, so what do we need to get through today? Well, all of the rest of this chapter. What we're going to talk a lot about today is connective tissue proper. So connective tissue proper is the connective tissue that properly connects one tissue type to another. So we've got 6 types that are grouped into 2 subclasses. Loose connective tissue propers, where we have a loose arrangement of all those protein fibers we talked about, or dense connective tissue proper, where all of those protein fibers are densely packed together. And so we got, these are kind of more strong. I don't know why this is cutting off the bottom of this presentation. So we can see 2 of them here, but we'll talk about all of them in a minute. So let's just talk about all of them. Our first type of connective tissue proper. Now we're going to look at our loose connective tissues, and then our dense connective tissues. We'll talk about the cells that we find, the composition of their extracellular matrix, and locations in the body. In addition, so that's like all of the anatomy, and then we'll talk about the functions that that tissue serves. So our first is our most abundant. Anytime you have the most abundant of something, it's the most important. So areolar connective tissue is really our most important connective tissue proper because it's going to be found like all over the place. And as we said last time when we talked about epithelial tissues, we said epithelial tissues were avascular, so they didn't have their own blood supply. They had to be supported by an underlying connective tissue. That underlying connective tissue is this stuff called lamina propria that is areolar connective tissue. So it's the most abundant. Its structure, as far as the structure goes, we've got fibroblasts that are secreting an extracellular matrix that is pretty loose, and there's a loose arrangement of cells in it. It's, I mean, it's gel-like, but it's not like really thick gel like cartilage has in it. And our cells are kind of very loosely arranged. And what we find is that we also have in this extracellular matrix all 3 fiber types. And they're just kind of loosely scattered throughout that extracellular matrix. So for our ground substance, it's this loose gel-like kind of ground substance that's holding all 3 fiber types. There are a lot of collagen fibers, and this tissue, since it's the most abundant, it's kind of, we could think of it as being like the most important. The function we could say really is it's the best at connecting one tissue type to another. So it's like our best example of connective tissue proper. We'll say it forms the lamina propria. So this is going to give us the special function of serving our epithelial tissues. I wish we could do a cadaver lab, because I love showing areolar connective tissue. You can see it between the muscles when you pull layers of muscles apart. So like in your abdomen, my son is looking at me like with this horror on his face right now. But in your abdomen, you have 4 layers of abdominis muscles. And so like if you pull them apart, and like look at between these real thin layers of muscles, you see all this areolar connective tissue. It's all spiderwebby and super cool. So yeah, there's that. Let me make sure this camera's still focused. Okay, ooh, light blue is hard to see. Duly noted. Okay, so it forms the lamina propria, serves our epithelial tissues. It's the best at connecting one tissue type to another. The primary cell type that we find are fibroblasts. Let's see, what else do we want to say? I'll give you location. No, I didn't give you a location. Well, I kind of did, between muscles. But, and lamina propria, that's a location underneath our epithelial tissues. So another location of areolar connective tissue is like it forms the top layer of the dermis of your skin, is that keratinized stratified squamous epithelial tissue that is kind of water resistant and can be readily sloughed off. Okay, that is served by lamina propria, and okay. So the top layer of your dermis, which is just under your epidermis is that keratinized stratified squamous epithelial tissue we talked about last time. Just underneath that we have this layer of your dermis called the papillary layer, and that is areolar connective tissue. So different places we find it. One, lamina propria, we find it between tissues, like between muscles, but we also find it as the papillary layer in your dermis. So its function is really to connect one tissue type to another and provide like blood supply to the epithelial tissue, bring in blood, all of that. Okay.
You done?
No, just with areolar connective tissue. Now I'm moving on to adipose tissue. Adipose tissue is fat tissue, and it has the highest amount of cell type that we find in adipose tissue are the adipocytes. There are also some fibroblasts. So I think the picture in your book, you can see fibroblasts in addition to the adipocytes. So here we've got adipocytes. These are going to accumulate a large fat droplet, so that fat is going to be able to act as an energy reserve. So these accumulate a large fat droplet. And they have some fibroblasts scattered between there. So an interesting fact about adipocytes or adipose tissue is that it's amitotic. So adipocytes really don't divide much after 2 years old. So at about 2 years, you have all the fat cells you're ever going to have. And you may say to me, well, how is that possible? How am I gaining and losing weight all the time? And what's happening is you're just making each adipocyte bigger and larger. As you gain weight, the fat droplet gets bigger. And as you lose that weight, the fat droplet gets smaller as you burn off that fuel reserve. So that's pretty cool. The only time you would ever see an increase in adipocyte number is in a case called morbid obesity. And as it sounds, it's pretty morbid. And when you're at that point, you're not far from death. White fat, this is what we have, all us adults. And so this is traditionally what you think of it. It looks yellow under the scope. So this is our adult fat. Brown fat is found in babies and fishes, and actually they're seeing in some kind of monks, and so now in some exercisers who are starting to behave like the monks. Brown fat is really, really good at insulation, so it keeps you warmer, and you find brown fat, it seems to be healthier as well. You find brown fat in fish who are in cold water, and again in babies who haven't had a whole lot of time to develop a subcutaneous layer. So brown fat, this is in babies and fish. Well, what about these monks and all these bodybuilders? So they have found that there are these monks who will like go to some ice cave and like meditate and sweat and like just they're able to sit in these super cold environments and like be hot anyway. Or I think that they're, yeah, no, this is so yeah. Bodybuilders aren't doing that. What are bodybuilders doing? They're doing the inverse because it works both ways. You could go to a really hot environment. Is that what it is? Yeah. No, I don't know. I'm messing this all up now. Ice baths, people. Take ice baths. So yeah, if you get really hot, like work out, and then take a really cold shower or get into an ice bath afterwards, those people also seem to have their white fat be replaced by brown fat, and brown fat is healthier and keeps you warmer. So I don't know, that's just, I like to call those brain breaks. You might want to call it a tangent, but we're going to keep that between us. And I'm just going to go on them sometimes. All right, so potato, adipose tissue. Its job is to store fat, and the cells are these adipose cells. What else? We've got a lot of collagen. Well, there's not a lot of collagen fibers in it, but the protein fibers that we find in the extracellular matrix. Well, what do we want to say about the extracellular matrix? It's sparse. So there's not a whole lot of extracellular matrix, and it's similar to the extracellular matrix of areolar connective tissue, and we'll leave it at that. Because why is it similar to the extracellular matrix of areolar connective tissue? Because the other cell type that we have are fibroblasts. So what's really unique is these adipocytes and what they're doing. So as far as functions go, what's the function of adipose tissue? Well, it's going to store fuel. Fat is fuel. It's actually the best kind of, the most energy you can get per gram of biological macromolecule. It comes from fat. It's just harder to get, but it doesn't mean it's not worth it. It is. What else does it do? It insulates so that you don't lose too much body temperature. That's what's important about brown fat. What else does it do? It protects. What do I mean it protects? Well, it can protect from trauma. So your eyeballs actually have a lot of fat around them because they're protected, or they're surrounded in a bony orbit. And so you want to protect these soft eyeballs from this hard bone, and you can do that by packing some fat around there. Your kidneys, those retroperitoneal organs I mentioned at the beginning of lecture, also have some fat around them. So it also offers some protection from trauma. What else? So where do I find it? Well, all those places I just listed. But actually, like, what we really care about is all this stuff that, like right now, that I can see when I'm editing my videos. That is called the subcutaneous layer. So subcutaneous layer, all of the fat that you're growing and burning and growing and burning is what's called the hypodermis. It's underneath your skin. We'll talk about it when we get to the integument. It's not part of the skin. It's underneath your skin, and it's called the subcutaneous layer. So for locations, where do we find it? Subcutaneous layer. We find it surrounding your eyeballs and kidneys. Eyes and kidneys. You actually will see it around your heart as well. The older you get, the more fat that you have. You'll start seeing it pack around all of your organs. Another reason I wish we could go to cadaver lab. We have a 103-year-old cadaver right now who has so much fat around all of her organs. It's pretty crazy. And the level of atherosclerosis that she has in her blood vessels is quite phenomenal. So yeah, all right. Let's see, what else? Okay. The last type of loose connective tissue proper is reticular connective tissue. This is really rare. So areolar connective tissue is the most abundant. Adipose tissue is also pretty darn abundant. It forms your whole subcutaneous layer, for goodness sakes. All under your skin. So it's also pretty common. Reticular connective tissue is not very common. And what's different about reticular connective tissue is that it really has a high proportion of those reticular cells, reticular fibers that we were talking about. So the cells, you actually are called, I know later they're called reticulocytes. I can't remember if this chapter calls them reticulocytes, but they're fibroblasts, reticulocytes. It's probably what happens, is that they start as fibroblasts that are going to secrete our extracellular matrix And the extracellular matrix here is similar, again, to areolar in that it's gel-like, but also kind of loose and fluid-like. And but the difference now is that the ground, sorry, that's the ground substance, it's similar to areolar ground substance. The difference now is that when we look at our protein fiber composition, we really have a high proportion of these reticular fibers. This is where we find the most reticular protein fibers in connective tissue. And so then these, once you're mature, whatever, then these are going to become our reticulocytes. And this tissue is forming what's called the stroma of lymphatic organs. So let me just take a moment to tell you what lymphatic organs are. They house all of our white blood cells. So if we think about like your kidney, it's a solid organ that's filtering your blood. So it's got a connective tissue sheath around it, and we want it to be like really solid. Same thing with your heart. It's muscular, we want it to be really solid. If you have an organ that whole cells need to readily be able to get into and out of, you don't want to like have all of these walls in that organ that those cells have to get through. So instead, you make a different kind of organ that has a lot of these reticular fibers in it, and they form this stroma, which is like this fibrous skeleton of those lymphatic organs. So now our white blood cells can get into and out of them through that kind of mesh network that reticular connective tissue forms. So the function is to form the stroma of lymphatic organs. So that our white blood cells can get in and out. I'm sorry it's so hard to see. You can always slow down and rewind. Alright. And my lighting's weird because there's a storm. It's just awesome. So where do we find it? In our lymphatic organs. The function is to form the stroma. What's a stroma? It's like a fibrous skeleton. And you will get to look at all of these with the lab assistant, and I'm sure she will point out to you all of these different fiber types and all of the different everything you need to know, because that's her job. Okay, so those were our loose connective tissues. Now in our dense connective tissues, they have very kind of low levels of pretty viscous ground substance. And the protein fibers are going to be really different between each, and they are going to be kind of stronger. These things we find in areas that need strength as opposed to all this other stuff. Okay, so our first type is dense regular connective tissue. So the cells that we have here are fibroblasts. So fibroblasts. And they are secreting a ground substance or an extracellular matrix that has a ground substance which is very sparse, or I'll say we've got low levels of kind of pretty viscous ground substance. And then what's going to change between each of them is our protein fibers. So in dense regular connective tissue, what you have is a whole lot of collagen fibers that are arranged in this really regular pattern. And what you'll see when you look at the slides is that there are some little like white spaces. This would all be pink. And so and then you'd see like some little white spaces between these long, thick fibers, and then squashed in between there is where we would find our fibroblasts. So it's really this, as far as anatomy goes, we could say that we've got a high proportion of collagen fibers that are packed tightly in a parallel fashion. So they're packed tightly together in a parallel fashion. That's what makes it regular. There's a mosquito right here. I don't want him to get me. Oh, it didn't work. Packed tightly in a parallel fashion. Wow. So this is really, really, really strong. Dense regular connective tissue we find forming our tendons and ligaments. Do you know what tendons and ligaments do? They hold bones to bones or muscles to bones. And so their job, if we're thinking of like a one sentence tagline, what's the function of dense regular connective tissue? It resists tension or it resists stretch when applied in one direction. So dense regular connective tissue, the function is to resist stretch in one direction. And you could think of this stretch as like resist tension in one direction. Okay, where do we find it? Ligaments and tendons. Okay, how do I know which attaches what to what? Well, I'm gonna change this and actually go to lowercase. Okay, and I'm gonna make it a fancy lowercase t. Okay, so dense regular connective tissue is found in ligaments and tendons. How do I know what attaches what to what? Well, a little L is straightforward, and attaching bone to bone is a straightforward job. So a ligament attaches bone to bone. Okay, a tendon. Well, if I'm gonna attach a muscle to a bone, I'm gonna have to like go around, like it's gonna be not as straightforward, it'll be a little curvy. So if I've got a bone, I'm attaching it to a muscle, well, if I got a muscle I'm attaching to a bone, the tendon's doing the job. So tendons attach muscles to bones, and these are very, very, very strong. Dense regular connective tissue is one of my favorite tissues in the body, like as an individual tissue, because of how strong it is. So like on the cadaver, you could grab the IT band. I can't get my leg up high enough, I'm too short. But like there, the IT band, the iliotibial tract, is right here. It's this band of dense regular connective tissue. You can pull on it. It's like so thin. It's like tissue thin, like Kleenex thin. You can pull that and like lift up the whole leg without tearing that tissue. So dense regular connective tissue is super, super strong. All right, dense irregular connective tissue is made of the same stuff, but now our collagen fibers are not arranged in this parallel fashion. They are instead all over the place, just like in a very irregular arrangement. So, and we've got more ground substance. So now we still have fibroblasts. In our dense irregular connective tissue, we have a little bit more of that ground substance. It's still pretty thick, so we could say this is a viscous. It's still like low levels, but it's more than in dense regular. So low levels of a viscous ground substance. And now the protein fibers are still collagen, and it's a high amount of collagen fibers that we find. But what you'll see is they're kind of found like all over the place. Like here and here, and like, oh, there's one there, and oh, here's one here, and oh, in the middle of all that nonsense is the fibroblast, and then like in between it's the ground substance. Oh, and here's one here, and here's one here. So dense irregular connective tissue is made of the same stuff, and it has a lot of collagen, which means it can resist still a lot of stretch and still a lot of tension, but now because of that irregular arrangement of fibers, it can resist tension in many directions. So what we'll see is that the thickest layer of your skin is the lowest layer, the reticular layer of the dermis, We're not going there right now. And that is made of dense, irregular connective tissue. And it can resist stretch in many directions. So all of the characteristics of those three tissue types, the deepest being the dense, irregular connective tissue, and then next is the areolar connective tissue, and then on top of that is the keratinized stratified squamous epithelial tissue. Each of those layers has characteristics that allows your skin to move as a cohesive fabric. So it's all like all those cells are stitched together and your skin is like a fabric, which is pretty cool. Not all of your tissues are like that. So why did I tell you that? To tell you the function. It resists stretch in many directions, and I just told you a great location, the dermis of your skin. So dense, irregular connective tissue, we could say it has a high proportion of collagen fibers that are arranged in an irregular fashion. Where do we find it? It's in the dermis of the skin and in areas where we need to resist tension in many directions. Okay, I didn't even write that part down. I just yacked a whole lot. I'm not going to take more time to write it down because you can do it. Okay, the last type of connective tissue proper is elastic connective tissue, and it looks kind of similar to dense regular connective tissue in its composition and the way that the fibers are arranged, but what's different is it's got a lot of elastic fibers in it. And that example that I talked about when I talked about elasticity was the elastic connective tissue that we find in the great walls of the heart. So it's still fibroblasts, so I shouldn't have erased those, and they're still secreting extracellular matrix. Now we've got our sparse ground substance, just like it was sparse in dense regular connective tissue. I mean, still there's not a lot in irregular, but there's more. So here, this is our sparse ground substance. It's pretty viscous. Now we've got a high proportion of elastic fibers. So we find this in places where you really want to have a lot of elasticity. So the ability to stretch and recoil. So the function is to provide elasticity. And like an example of location, we could say the great vessels leaving the heart. Everything itches. That mosquito bit me everywhere. Everywhere. The great vessels leaving the heart contain a high proportion of elastic connective tissue, and again that's so that they can resist the stretch during the pressure, due to the pressure of ventricular contraction when they're forcing out all that blood, and then bounce back and still exert pressure on the blood when the ventricles relax. Okay. So a couple questions, and then we'll just quickly go through the rest of our connective tissues. There is one more portion of this chapter, but I think you're just going to get that recorded in late night anatomy, because I got to feed this guy some dinner, and if the lighting's going to stink, then we might as well just go for it. Okay, so let's see. Okay, you would expect to find blank fibers in areas that withstand great amounts of tension. You would expect to find blank fibers in areas that experience great amounts of tension. Collagen fibers, yes, they're the strongest, they have the most tensile strength. Wonderful. Okay, so let's quickly talk about our other connective tissue types. All right, so we have three types of cartilage in the body that we're really going to talk a lot more about when we get to the skeletal system or the bone tissues chapter, because cartilage is found in between our bones in the skeleton. We find it a couple other places as well, so we'll just briefly address cartilage now and talk more about it later. So hyaline cartilage is our most abundant cartilage, and so as with everything, the more abundant, the more important. So hyaline cartilage we find, like these costal cartilages are hyaline cartilage. We find hyaline cartilage as what's called articular cartilage, covering the ends of long bones in joints. Hyaline cartilage forms the bulk of your nose. So you have some nasal bones up here, but hyaline cartilage is forming the bulk of your nose. So hyaline cartilage is kind of all over the place. It also actually forms most of the fetal skeleton. So for hyaline cartilage, we'll say it forms the fetal skeleton, or most of the fetal skeleton. We find it as articular cartilage, which is the cartilage that covers the ends of long bones and joints. You find it as your costal cartilages, which are going to attach your ribs to your sternum. Trying to find it like all over the place. Articular cartilage, costal cartilages. Yeah, so it's pretty important. Forms your nose. Again, have a look at the figure in your book. It shows you all the places you can find it and you can see it. Hyaline cartilage is pretty distinct. The thing about cartilage when you're looking at it histologically is that the ground substance for cartilage is semi-solid. It is pretty darn tough. So the chondroblasts secrete all of this semi-solid ground substance, and all three fiber types are present as well, but a lot of collagen fibers, and that kind of looks amorphous. But then as they mature into chondrocytes that become entrapped in this little space, you'll see in the picture, it's like a white space with the chondrocyte in it. That space is called a lacuna. And so that's like hyaline cartilage is easy to tell apart from like fibrocartilage and elastic cartilage in its indistinction. It's pretty amorphous. Its ground substance or its extracellular matrix, I should say, is pretty amorphous. So we'll say as far as anatomy goes, that we've got chondroblasts that secrete an extracellular matrix that is semi-solid. It kind of looks amorphous. It's got all three fiber types, but it's got a lot of collagen fibers, so it's nice and strong. Okay, our next type of cartilage, fibrocartilage, has a high proportion of collagen fibers that are packed in a really regular way. Instead of in an amorphous kind of fashion like we see in hyaline cartilage, in fibrocartilage the collagen fibers are packed together like they were in dense regular connective tissue. And what that does is it allows fibrocartilage to resist a lot of compressive stress. Which, when we look at where we find fibrocartilage, is going to make a lot of sense. But if we wanted to talk about what is its anatomy, what is it made of, we could say that the chondroblasts, and they're actually, I should have finished this out up here, they're going to become chondrocytes that get entrapped in a lacuna. Okay, so in hyaline cartilage again, the chondroblasts are going to secrete this extracellular matrix that has a semi-solid ground substance. All three fiber types that are pretty amorphous in there, high proportion of collagen, it's really strong. Those chondroblasts then, after they secrete that and that become solid, they're going to entrap themselves in this space called the lacuna and become a mature chondrocyte. The chondrocytes then maintain the extracellular matrix of hyaline cartilage. All right, fibrocartilage. In fibrocartilage, you'll see that you've got your chondrocytes entrapped in a lacuna. That's probably too many close together. But now they're entrapped like in a space that is kind of squished between this regular arrangement of collagen fibers. So it's pretty easy to tell hyaline cartilage apart from the other two because the other two are very distinct in the way that they look. So in our fibrocartilage, what we can say is that our chondrocytes, sure, they were chondroblasts that secreted all this extracellular matrix. So, but then the chondrocytes are entrapped in a lacuna and maintain that. And what we could say about this extracellular matrix is that it's got the same ground substance that is semi-solid. And now what we have is a high proportion of collagen protein fibers that are packed in this really regular arrangement. And so what you'll see is that we're going to entrap those chondrocytes like between this really regular arrangement of collagen fibers. Okay, and we find fibrocartilage in places where we need to have compressive strength. So you find fibrocartilage here in the intervertebral discs. So fibrocartilage resists compression, and the bodies of these vertebrae are stacking on top of each other. And so these little intervertebral discs have pads of fibrocartilage and are pads of fibrocartilage. This little thing right here between the pubic bones is called the pubic symphysis. That's a pad of fibrocartilage, and we don't have the pads of fibrocartilage here in the knee. They're called menisci, or one is a meniscus, and that's another pad of fibrocartilage that when you lock your knee, it resists the compressive force. So the function for our fibrocartilage is going to be to resist compression or resist compressive force. And where do we find it? We find it in three places. Our intervertebral discs, what's called the pubic symphysis between the pubic bones, there in the front of your pelvis, and in the menisci of the knee. Okay. Now our last type of cartilage is elastic cartilage, and the function of elastic cartilage is to be really flexible but maintain shape. So I'll give you a hint. You may find elastic cartilage right here in your ear. You do. And the only other place is in this thing called your epiglottis that flops down over your larynx to cover your, flops down over your larynx to make sure that no food goes down there when you're swallowing. I was hoping Alex had one. I used to have a model here, but I took all my 202 models home. So yeah, elastic cartilage, the function would be to maintain shape, but be flexible, but provide flexibility. And if we're thinking about it, it still has this, our chondrocytes are entrapped in a lacuna, and they're maintaining the extracellular matrix that was secreted by our chondroblasts, and that extracellular matrix has ground substance that is semi-solid. And now the protein fibers, sure, we have some collagen fibers in there as well, but we have a high proportion of elastic fibers. And if you recall, elastic fibers give you elasticity, which is the ability to bounce back. So in the two places that we find elastic cartilage, you bounce back. So this thing, your epiglottis, sits over your larynx, so that when you swallow food, it like sits up like this when you're breathing, and so air can go down into your respiratory system. But when you swallow food, it flops down over your larynx so that the food can slip past into the esophagus and not go into your respiratory system. And then when you're done swallowing, it bounces back. So that's where we find elastic cartilage. I guess the last thing I would say is that I didn't specifically address forming most of the fetal skeleton is a function. Covering the ends of long bones is something you do, it's a function, but why do I do this? It smooths it out, so that's kind of the functions of hyaline cartilage. Yeah, all right. Good deal, we're almost done. That's a lie. Okay, we have two types of bone tissue. So bone is also a connective tissue. This is our only solid tissue. And we have lots of different cell types in bone. So we've got these osteoprogenitor cells that are going to become the osteoblasts that secrete our solid bone matrix. But we also have other cells called osteoclasts that are kind of related to blood. We've got other cells called bone lining cells. So we'll just talk about all of those cells. When the cells specifically, when we get to bone, for now, if I were to, why are we talking about this? As tissues, how am I going to be tested? That's what everybody wants to know. How am I going to be tested? I could say something to you like, the following cell types can be found in connective tissues. A, adipocytes. B, fibroblasts. C, osteoblasts. Okay. D, all of the above. The answer is all of the above. Adipocytes are found in adipose tissue. Fibroblasts are found in connective tissue proper, in our loose connective tissues. Osteoblasts are found in bone. I won't worry about all the other bone cell types right now. Well, you could know if we've got a blast or immature. Osteocytes, sure, it trapped themselves in the solid matrix that's called osteoid. So we'll just, okay, yeah. We've got osteoblasts, and they're going to secrete osteoid. And this is the solid extracellular matrix of bone. It's got solid ground substance, a high portion of collagen fibers. We'll talk about how that looks and how it's all formed. So these osteocytes will become entrapped in a lacuna, just like our chondroblasts became chondrocytes entrapped in the lacuna. Our osteocytes are going to become entrapped in a lacuna, and then they will be lacunae. They will be the mature cells that maintain the osteoid. Okay, so there. Those are the cells. We have different types of bone tissue, compact bone and spongy bone. Compact bone is everything that you see when you're looking at a bone or at a skeleton with your eye. So compact bone covers the entire surface of your skeleton. But deep to compact bone in the ends of your long bones, and then deep to compact bone in all of your flat bones, and then in weird places in your irregular bones. You have spongy bone. Spongy bone is actually the site of red bone marrow, and that's where blood is produced. So for functions of bone, we got a lot of functions. So let's just finish with our anatomy and then we'll get into our physiology. So for compact bone, this is what you see if we're looking for locations. And so it's all over. Spongy bone is deep to compact bone. Not everywhere, but like in the ends of our long bones and in our flat bones and weird places in our irregular bones. We'll talk more about that later, but all of that is important to be aware of because spongy bone contains red bone marrow. You have two types of red bone marrow. You have one type of red bone marrow. You have another type of bone marrow, which is yellow. Two types of bone marrow, red marrow and yellow marrow. The important thing for blood cell production is red bone marrow, and that's what we find in spongy bone. So red bone marrow, we'll say this is the site of blood production, blood cell production. Why am I telling you that? Because it's a function of bone. So if I were to ask you on the test, the following The following are functions of connective tissues. A, connect one tissue type to another. B, produce blood cells. No, maybe I wouldn't do it. Yeah, B, produce blood cells. C, store nutrients. D, all of the above. What would the answer be? All of the above, right? Because we store nutrients and we store fuel, fat. We store minerals in bone. It's a whole other thing. But this is also the site of blood cell production, which is really weird. People don't usually think of the skeleton as being involved in blood, but it is. So be aware of that. So where do we find bone? I wonder, maybe in the skeleton. Just maybe. Okay. Blood, where do we find blood? Well, it's formed in red bone marrow, as we just discussed. Blood is our only fluid connective tissue, and it has a bunch of different cell types that we'll just clump together right now as red blood cells, whose job is to transport oxygen around the body, and white blood cells, whose job is to fight pathogens. So white blood cells give us immunity. So for blood, the cells are red blood cells, which I will from now on abbreviate as RBCs. And their job is to transport oxygen. They do transport CO2 too, but not as much, and it's not like really as important. The big important job is to transport oxygen to the tissues, because we need oxygen for aerobic respiration. The other cell type that we have in blood, well, there are a bunch, but we can collectively clump them together as white blood cells for now, abbreviated WBCs. They have fancier names, both of these things. Red blood cells are erythrocytes. White blood cells are leukocytes. We'll talk about that more in 202. The job of white blood cells is to fight pathogens and give you immunity. And the extracellular matrix of blood is a little unique. I mean, they're all unique from each other. But it is liquid plasma. So the ground substance is liquid plasma, and there aren't really protein fibers per se. There are a bunch of proteins floating around in the blood, and one called fibrinogen, which gets pulled out and becomes fibrin and stops bleeding. That's a whole tangent we're not going to go down. So for blood, what we could say is that it's got liquid matrix called plasma. And contains proteins that we will talk more about next semester. All right, I have a question for you. You would expect to find blank fibers in areas that undergo a lot of stretch and rebound. All right, you would expect to find blank fibers in areas that undergo a lot of stretch and rebound. Think on that while I erase this board a little better. Stretch and rebound is the same thing as stretch and recoil. So the answer is elastic. And you might say, yeah, but why isn't it collagen? Because you have collagen fibers in all your connective tissues, and they're the most abundant fibers. It sure is, but in areas that we need to have a lot of stretch and rebound, we pack up extra elastic fibers with those collagen fibers. And in some tissues, like elastic connective tissue or elastic cartilage, which are different things, both connective tissues, but different types of connective tissues, we have a high proportion of elastic fibers. All right. Muscle tissue. So we're just really going to briefly talk about muscle tissue, and then we're going to talk about it in a lot more detail later. So the things that everybody wants to talk about, like with our muscle tissues, is what do they look like? What do their cells look like? Are the tissues striated or not? Are they voluntary or involuntary? one nucleus or more than one nucleus. Yeah, that's pretty much it. Those are the big ones. So skeletal muscle, voluntary. Striated, so you can see little banding in it because the unit of contraction is the thing called the sarcomere. Multinucleate. So what happens is you get a lot of these little myoblasts in utero that like fuse together to form muscle fibers that are as long as the muscle they reside in. So that always blows my mind because like look at this muscle right here. This is one called sartorius and it's long. And one single cell in sartorius is that long. And I wish that the flash on my camera was working or that it was daylight and my son had napped so that this could have been done. But alas, we go with what we got. So yeah, muscle cells, skeletal muscle cells, amazing. I really like muscles. You're gonna find that out soon enough. So it's voluntary, it's striated, it's multinucleate. Oh, our cells are fibers. They're these big long muscle fibers. In our cardiac muscle, we have these little myocardiocytes, cardiomyocytes, like they get a bunch of different names. Contractile cells. They are cardiac muscle tissue. It's kind of branched. It's also striated. You can have anywhere from 1 to 3 nuclei per cell. Totally involuntary. So that would be the key words for those. Smooth muscle is smooth. It doesn't have striations. Also involuntary. Single nucleus per smooth muscle cell. So if we think about all of these things, what do? They contract and they move stuff. The skeletal muscle contracts and moves your bones. Your cardiac muscle contracts and pushes blood from your heart into your blood vessels. Smooth muscle moves whatever's in the organ. So if it's in your stomach, it's moving food and gastric juice. If it's your blood vessels, which are organs, then it's moving blood. So just be aware of that. Muscle cells contain these contractile filaments that are made of these proteins, actin and myosin. We're going to talk about this a lot when we get to skeletal muscle. So I just told you everything you need to know. Skeletal muscle is the only thing that you have voluntary control over in your body. It's multinucleate. We have multinucleate skeletal muscle fibers that are striated and amazing. Cardiac muscle, myocardiocytes that are branch cells. Single, 2 multinucleate, involuntary. Smooth muscle, smooth, involuntary, single nucleate. Nervous tissue. I love nervous tissue too. I think I love the nervous system the most, and I love muscle tissue the most, but I can't figure out which organ I love the most, the heart or the lungs. It's all so great, and different things are great for different reasons. Nervous tissue is great because it's so stimulating. That was a joke, because you can stimulate it and it will produce this thing called an action potential. So this also has its whole own chapter, and nervous tissue is what's going to form our brain, spinal cord, and nerves. It helps to regulate and control all of our body functions. Really, we've got 2 control systems. The nervous system is our fast control system, and we've got specialized cells, neurons, that are going to be able to receive signals and conduct action potentials or nerve impulses. And then we've got all of the cells that support them. There are a bunch. So we will talk more about that when we get to the nervous system. So then now that we've talked about connective tissues, you can lay that with what you know about epithelial tissues to understand membranes. So we've got covering and lining membranes that are composed of at least 2 primary tissue types: an epithelial tissue that's bound to an underlying connective tissue proper. That connective tissue proper layer we're going to call a lamina propria. Why do we need connective tissue proper under there? Because epithelial tissues do not have their own blood supply. You cannot be a living cell without blood supply. So what we find is that we have these 3 types of membranes, covering and lining membranes, that are going to have those 2 types of tissues: an epithelial layer and a connective tissue proper layer. So cutaneous membrane, that's just another name for skin. I said subcutaneous earlier was our adipose. Sub means below, that's below the skin. Subcutaneous is below your cutaneous membrane. Your cutaneous membrane is your skin. So this is keratinized, stratified squamous epithelium in the epidermis attached to, a thick layer of connective tissue in the dermis. I told you the 2 layers of the dermis, what tissue types they were. Does anybody remember? The papillary layer was areolar connective tissue supporting the epidermis, and then the reticular layer, the thickest layer, was dense irregular connective tissue. Okay, so, all right, just be aware of that. The unique thing about cutaneous membranes, or skins, is that skin is a dry membrane, and it's dry because of this keratin that gets added. Keratin is a water-resistant protein, and it helps you to not lose too much water or take on too much water or absorb anything for that matter. So it kind of gives you some resistance to absorbing stuff. Okay, mucous membranes, collectively called mucosa. They are, or mucosae, mucosa indicates the location of it, not its cell composition, collectively called mucosae. They lay in our body cavities that are open to the exterior. So what's open to the exterior? My big yakking mouth right now, digestive, respiratory, urogenital tracts. These are moist membranes that are bathed in secretions like mucus or urine, or secretions. Well, there's mucus all throughout your digestive tract too. But other secretions. Moist membranes bathed by secretions or urine. You've got an epithelial sheet that's overlying a loose connective tissue called lamina propria. Which loose connective tissue forms lamina propria? We just talked about it. It's the most abundant in the body. Areolar connective tissue. Okay, so mucous membranes. And the reason that we say it's an epithelium over a lamina propria is because depending on where you're looking determines what type of epithelium it is. So, for example, in my oral cavity, I have the non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelial tissue. In my pharynx, I've got a little bit of that. But in my, in the respiratory part of my pharynx, I've got pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium, and then I go into my stratified non-keratinized squamous epithelium, and that goes through my esophagus. And then when I get to my stomach, I'm simple columnar. And then when I go from my pseudostratified, I go to simple columnar. So it changes. The epithelium changes through these organs, but the lamina propria does not. It's areolar connective tissue. So lamina propria is areolar connective tissue, and this is underlying and supporting an overlying epithelial layer. And again, that epithelial layer is going to vary depending on what you're looking at. Okay, so our serous membranes we've already talked a little bit about. These are collectively called serosa. This is found in our ventral body cavities. These are closed cavities. So these are simple squamous epithelial tissues lying on a really thin areolar connective tissue. The parietal serosal layer lines the internal cavity walls. The visceral layer covers the organ. We talked about this the second day of class. We talked in chapter 1. We talked about this. The cavity between the layers is full of serous fluid. This helps to moisten the membrane to allow to reduce friction between the organs. We have special names like for the pleural membrane surround the lungs, pericardium surrounds the heart, peritoneum surrounds the abdomen. That wraps up tissues. So if you have any questions, make sure to post them in the Teachers Helping Students Succeed discussion board, and I will see you soon.
That girl been saying most of budget.
Which girl?
The girl on the camera.
I'm the girl in the camera. What? The head of the clavicle is articulating with the sternum, and then over here, meow. I'm just gonna cut this whole scene.